So let's talk about the big changes to the core gameplay of Warhammer 40k, going through new deployments, new ways to score, and a whole load of buffs to battle line things with Games Workshop's new mission deck. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking about Warhammer 40k's core rule update, with the new mission deck for the game which makes all sorts of changes to the things that the armies are actually going to be doing in battle, and is going to be the main way to play Warhammer 40k for the next year. Broadly speaking, I think it looks like quite good fun. It is going to shake up army playstyle and what units get picked, I think. I'm looking forward to getting some games in with it. This mission set is the new chapter approved deck. Games Workshop basically bringing out a new mission deck called Pariah Nexus to update from the Leviathan one that came at the start of the edition, taking a fair few lessons learned along the way, and they've quite majorly overhauled the core mission rules along with every single section of the card deck. Pretty much every single card has had some sort of change to it, and some entire sections have been altered. The highlights for this one are new secret missions to replace the little used gambit mechanic, and these look far more impactful and disruptive to the opponents. The return of actions that I talked about in a video last night, cutting out Objective Control 0 units, and basically placing a bunch more restrictions, though helping out things like Titanic Knight characters. There's a bunch of altered deployments, including Dawn of War, the single most normal way to set up games of 40k, and primary and secondary missions altered quite a bit, both for balance and for clarity. The way that secondary missions are drawn have changed a little bit, as you can now use the new orders stratagem multiple times. Several mission rules have tried to place more of an emphasis on battle line, lots of small advantages to your standard rank and file troops, though basically every single mission rule bar one has been swapped out as well. And then eventually all of this will come alongside new points for various different units, an FAQ to the game, and a balanced data slate, all of that dropping in the next couple of weeks or so, and I'm looking forward to covering that here on the channel. Loads to talk about here though, so let's jump straight in. Here are the rough contents of the mission deck. 69 cards total, plus a paper rule set for the core way that missions are played. That's the one that's got things like the new orders stratagem and the core rules for actions now. There's one more deployment map, so there's 6 rather than 5. There's 10 mission rules rather than 12. There's still 9 primary missions, most of them rewritten at least a little bit. Slightly more secondary objectives than we had previously, with 2 decks of 18 of them, 1 attacker and 1 defender, though they're both the same. And as mentioned, gambits are replaced by those 4 fun secret missions, the idea of which is that they're a catch-up mechanic to allow a losing player to get back into the game later on. They do seem kind of powerful, and in the right situation could be a way to win a game fairly handily. I thought we'd start with a few things on the paper foldout and then move on to all the mission cards. First up, one thing that I was quite happy to see here was a clarification on reserves. There's basically a mission rule here that says that you can't bring in reserves before Battle Round 2 in normal circumstances. They do say literally on the card here that if a unit was on the board then put into strategic reserve, then this rule doesn't apply. So it could relate to things like, say, the Alaris Custodians teleporting around the board, or anything else that can go into strategic reserve early means that they can potentially come back on the board straight away in your opponent's turn 1, provided you went first. I feel like play on that certainly varied. I think that community consensus was that this wouldn't really be a change and that was the way that it worked before, but I think there was genuine ambiguity, and fixing that was a really good move. Another small change is that Titanic units now count as 2 deployments, and that feels like a fairly nice and appropriate leveler for Knights armies, where if you took just a few Titanic Knights you might have deployed your entire army when the opponents only just put down a couple of peripheral units. That does feel a bit more proportionate, and you might see a bit more of what your opponents put down before you have to put down your last drop. That seems cool. And then in the sequence of preparing for a battle, there's a specific step for redeploying units. This one's defined as a step in the deployment sequence just before rolling for first turn unless otherwise stated. So basically doubly confirming that you do your standard redeployments, not knowing who's going to go first or not, so you can't have absolute certainty as to whether or not you get the alpha strike or have to take it. Though it does say unless otherwise stated, and a few rules do say after knowing when first turn is, and those rules remain more unusually powerful. If both players have redeployment style units, then you alternate starting with the attacker. All of those seem nice changes and clarifications, good to have a slightly more robust mission set. Otherwise, the new orders stratagem is here. This is the one that you use if you've gone tactical missions, and when you draw your tactical objectives, you can spend 1 command point to discard one of the missions that you can't do, and draw a new one in the hope that it's something that you can. Previously, this was one that you could only use once per game, but now you can use it as many times as you want. It is still certainly a trade-off, as you're both spending 1 CP, and you might not gain that extra CP if you were ditching the objective at the end of the turn. But overall, it does just basically mean that you can convert more command points into chance for more victory points over the course of the game, and particularly towards the later end of the game, that can certainly be the best option. I'll talk about the secondary missions in a bit more detail going through them in a bit, but another quite major change for them is that in general you don't really get bonus points for taking tactical missions over fixed ones anymore. In the previous deck, the tactical missions generally scored you like +1 victory point for doing them that way, rather than if you picked it fixed. Now the only one that has any difference is the assassination objective, where tactical players score 5 victory points for slaying at least one character in a turn, where fixed players are just 4 victory points per character over the course of the game. Beyond that though, it's a lot more level, though perhaps a few of the easier high scoring objectives tend to be tactical ones as opposed to fixed. You just don't know what's coming next, so you can't plan and anticipate as much. The other major thing on the paper rules insert are the action rules, which are now centrally defined. Actions were a mechanic from 9th edition, and now they're a formal thing once more. The idea is that basically in your shooting phase, your unit decides to do some battlefield admin rather than fight, doing things like cleansing an objective, or deploying a teleport homer, or investigating a signal. The idea is that they're doing something mission related, so can't be fighting this turn, so you're trading off a bit of damage to get more victory points. On the previous set of the mission cards, there were a few things that were forbidden. If you're doing an action, then your unit had to be eligible to shoot, so couldn't have shot already, and usually couldn't have advanced or fallen back. Though certain units with the assault keyword or with special rules could, and you weren't allowed to declare any charges, though if you were already in melee, then you could fight in the fight phase. Now though, there's a much more expansive list of restrictions, far more than would have fit on any one of those little mission cards, so kind of needed its own section, plus a couple of actual benefits for Titanic characters. For the restrictions, you basically can't do an action if you're aircraft, if you're battle shocked, if the unit is OC0, which is a big change. You can't do them if they advanced or fell back, even if you have special rules. You can't do them if you're in engagement range, even if you have pistols. You can't do them if you're not eligible to shoot for another reason, though that's usually if you've already shot. And then once you've committed to doing the action until the end of the turn that you've started, you can't shoot, declare a charge, start another action, make a move outside of piling and consolidation moves, or leave the battlefield. Basically the idea is that a unit just can't be distracted doing other stuff, and can't be one of the units that usually has no interaction with objective markers like aircraft or OC0 units or battle shocked things. Highlighting the changes, these are the actual things that have changed here. Aircraft didn't usually used to have a restriction on actions, the OC0 one certainly didn't, and that was kind of big. It's going to see those tiny units that people often take along, like Nurglings, Scarabs, and Fenrisian Wolves and things, into far more of a niche or useless role. They're just going to be good for screening and nuisance charges and things now. The advance and falling back thing is new. Advancing meant that you often wanted things with the assault keyword, so you could advance, get to a point and do an action, but now you can't. The engagement range restriction wasn't previously one. You could do actions in close combat if you had pistol weapons, but now you won't be able to. And otherwise, I guess the make a move restriction is technically a little bit tighter wording. Previously, you were just forbidden from making charge moves if you have any other weird rules that allow you to make a move later in the turn than you normally would, then I guess that could still impact it. Leaving the battlefield is technically new as well, though not really a change, as most of these action type things required you to still be in the same place. Most actions got harder to do, but there was one unit class that will find them a little bit easier now, which are Titanic characters, so things like Questoris or Dominus, Imperial or Chaos Knights. They get 2 advantages compared with the rest in that you can still shoot while you're doing an action, so you could have a great big Crusader Knight stomp up to a midfield objective, do the cleanse action on that objective and still blaze away with all its guns, and you can also still do actions if you're in engagement range if they've been tagged by something weak and you don't care about too much, and they'll still be able to fight while they're there, but you still can't actually declare a charge with them. So say if you had a Knight Lancer running up to the mid-board to do a cleanse action, you wouldn't actually be able to follow that up with a charge, so you'd have to make the difficult decision between whether you're charging and destroying something or doing some victory point stuff. I guess in Theoryland it makes ranged Titanic units a particularly good source of actions, and you wouldn't have to compromise things like armigers by giving up their shooting and melee for a turn, though in reality you might still think twice about it, given that if you've got a ranged knight it might not want to be in the middle of the board right on the front line. It's still definitely a nice quality of life thing for knights players though. Overall I think it's fairly helpful that they centrally define these actions, and it does look like there's quite a lot of missions that reference them, both primary ones and secondary ones now, And I feel like armies are going to be trying to include a bunch of units that are kind of minimal investment or fast movement and have at least some OC. They're likely to be a bit of a go-to from this point. Next up, let's get onto the cards themselves, and first up we have deployment maps. Previously there were 5 of them, now there are 6. There's 2 new ones, and they have removed the sort of long diagonal board edge style one called Sweeping Engagement, and replaced that with a sort of blocky step deployment of the same name. They said in their commentary that people struggled to be able to measure it out particularly accurately, though it didn't feel like it was the end of the world really. Out of the others, they're basically unchanged, bar Dawn of War, which has had one interesting change. It looks like the measurements for that one now have 12-inch deployment zones from the edge of the board, rather than the 10-inch ones that they effectively have now. So that means that armies can start just 20 inches from each other if they both deploy on the line. I guess that's a bit of a boost to melee armies that want to get as close to the enemy as fast as possible. Otherwise, here are the new ones with my very basic graphic impressions. They're both slightly blocky, step deployment ones called Sweeping Engagement and then Tipping Point. They look like a very similar sort of setup, but one is long board edges and one is short board edges. Like the rest, they're all 5 objective missions with one objective in the centre of the board. For Sweeping Engagement with the long board edges, you basically have 2 blocks worth of deployment, one that's a big bit that goes 14 inches into the board, then a shallower bit that goes 8 inches into the board, and that again means that enemies can be setting up really quite close to each other there. If you put 2 units right at the tips of their deployment zones, they'd just be 16 inches away. So first turn charge potential, even just for standard infantry moving 6 inches. The other one, for tipping point, the big bits of the deployment zones are 20-inch deep, and the shallower bits are 12-inch deep, so that means that the tips of the deployment zones are around about 20 inches away. That one maybe feels a little bit less weird, given that that's only if you set up right at the tips and one player might choose not to. You still basically have a home field objective that's right in the centre of your territory, and then 3 ones in the midboard. These ones don't really look like they're going to be any easier to measure out than the diagonal one, to me at least, but I feel like they look nice enough. It's kind of interesting having a bit more power to put units a bit further forward, or be a bit more cagey and back them off towards the back ends of the deployment zone. Though compared with before, it looks like it's a small buff to things that want to get close and personal as fast as possible. Moving on, we've got the mission rules, which are the kind of twists to a mission. These aren't the ones that determine victory points or anything, but basically provide an extra bonus special rule to affect how your armies play the game overall. There were 12 of them previously, and now there's down to 10, so there's 2 of them fewer. Half of them give some sort of minor advantage to battle line units, though I feel like none of them is going to be absolutely game deciding if you've got a lot of battle line. The rest have all been rewritten bar one of them, so it's basically an entire removal of last edition's mission rules, so goodbye to things like Minefield and things, and they also removed the Chilling Rain one, which was the one that didn't have any rule. I've got slightly mixed feelings about the removal of Chilling Rain. That was quite a popular one, as to be honest there's quite a lot of things that are going on in a 40k mission anyway, between primaries, secondaries, and all the army interactions. Lots of people just couldn't really be bothered remembering one extra, slightly arbitrary thing, and just defaulted to Chilling Rain as a result. I think it was helpful enough to give people that option a bit more efficiently, but I guess this is Games Workshop trying to force people into playing actual mission rules, which has its pros and cons, I guess. I do find it a bit weird that some of them do help out specific datasheets, but some of them don't. It does mean that there's a bit of luck of the draw if you've got loads of battle line units and your opponent doesn't. It might matter a lot more if they get some sort of minor advantage compared with if they don't. I guess you always could just play without a mission rule, but now it's no longer an official option. I'd guess that fewer people will choose to. Otherwise, taking a look through the mission rules, here are the ones that help out battle line units, 5 out of the 10 of them. Raise banners gets you 1 victory point at the end of each turn for each objective marker that has a battle line unit on, but you can only score each individual objective like this once per game, so a max of 5 victory points for every single one on the board, and that's counted towards your secondary mission score. Not nothing, but not game changing unless it was ridiculously close otherwise. Then we've got Rapid Escalation, which allows you to put 10% of your army's points into Strategic Reserve as a battle line unit and bring that less than 10% unit on turn 1. Could be useful to get some good OC things in the midboard. Then there's a couple of ones for doing actions. One called Stalwarts, where every battle line unit can do actions if they're in engagement range and can shoot while doing actions. That genuinely does seem pretty helpful, to be fair. That ups the damage of them while they can still go about doing their business. That one feels like quite a powerful mission rule. And a similar sort of one which allows them to do actions when they're advancing or falling back, so it gives them a little bit more reach on where they go for them. Finally, there's one called Prepared Positions. This one allows you to target battle line units with Go to Ground and Heroic Intervention for 0 CP. Could be quite nice on armies with fighty battle line units like Custodians or Orcs, I guess. A bit of extra cover from Go to Ground certainly doesn't hurt either. They're still bound by the restriction of just one stratagem per phase, so you're just doing this on one battle line unit each turn. Again, that one feels at least fairly impactful. Battle line units will be a bit stronger in that one. Overall, if these do see regular play, then I feel like it might be enough to just about skew things towards the direction of battle line players for some armies. Given that half of them do feature battle line, there's a good chance that any one mission that you're playing will have something helpful for them. It might be more of a case of just being extra helpful to armies that wanted to take battle line anyway, though, as opposed to changing army construction by massive amounts if the battle line that you have access to wasn't really very good. Otherwise though, there's 5 more that don't revolve around battle line. Fog of War means that all units in the first battle round have the benefit of cover, and none of your units can use core stratagems outside of new orders that turn. I guess that's a bit of a weakness for ranged armies as opposed to melee that won't really care, and you wouldn't be able to overwatch and things turn 1, which could be kind of big. Smoke and Mirrors allows players to put one unit back into strategic reserve after deploying. So it could be a way to get more units in strategic reserve than you'd normally be able to, or just have one massive threat that the opponent had counter deploys to, and then hide it and put it away. The unit that you select for it can't be more than 25% of your total points cost. Adapt or Die is a kind of interesting mission type one. For tactical objectives, it means that twice per game you can draw another card, and then choose to shuffle your least preferred one back into the deck. And if you're going fixed missions, then once per battle you get to swap one of your fixed objectives to another fixed mission, and that's done at the end of your turn after scoring any victory points that you would have done for that fixed mission. I feel like that could be interesting enough for some clever plays if you think there's some fixed missions that you'll be able to do early in the game, and then maybe swap out to a different tactic for later on. You could even swap from one kill objective to a different kill objective, which is kind of interesting on paper. That one's definitely going to have a bit more thinking in order on the missions. Then there's Inspired Leadership. The Warlord grants +1 leadership to units that are within 9 inches of them if they can see them, and the Warlord's outside of their own deployment zone. Doesn't really hurt. I guess that's probably something that'll just happen in passing as opposed to really wanting to build around it. And finally, Hidden Supplies gives you an extra objective as per the Leviathan missions. You sort of split the central one, and the 2 new objectives move 6 inches directly towards the corners of the battlefield. That means this mission is basically the only one that has 6 objectives rather than 5, and if you have the ritual as your primary mission, then you draw a different card. Overall, I feel like most of those feel interesting and at least a little bit impactful for each game. Mostly things that maybe don't take too much headspace to realise the possibilities of, maybe beyond that Adapt or Die type one. Otherwise, it does mean that basically all the mission rules from the Leviathan deck have just gone away now. Things like minefields for taking damage on objectives, extra CP for the command point reroll, or the things that get in the way of infiltrators or deep strike type things. They're all gone away now in favour of these new mission rules and the ones for buffing battle line. Next up, we've got the primary missions themselves. These are the main rules for fighting over objectives and scoring the majority of your victory points there. They cap out at 50 victory points max towards your total of 100, and basically the idea is to hold on to the objectives mainly in the midboard, though each of them have slight twists. As with before, there's 9 of these total, and there's 7 new or slightly tweaked ones, and 2 remain pretty much entirely unchanged. Going through these, we've got Terraform. The idea of this one is that you score objective markers kind of normally for 4 victory points each for each one you control at the end of the command phase, and then you can also do a Terraform type action on any of the objectives outside of your deployment zone. That one ends at the end of your opponent's turn, so they have a chance to kill your unit before they can try and complete it. But then once you have done that, for the rest of the game, you also score 2 victory points for each terraformed objective on the board, whether or not it's under your control anymore. Basically, mainly try and score the central objectives as much as you can. And if you can manage to get away with a unit doing this action on the objective and surviving, then for the rest of the game, that objective is going to become a point generator for an extra 2 VP per turn. Otherwise, we've got the Ritual, which is the one which can allow you to put down extra objective markers. For this one, you bin off all the other objectives in the midboard bar the central one, and now units can deploy other objectives as an action, doing an action that ends at the end of your turn, and then you can put an objective marker somewhere that's exactly 12 inches from that central objective. and the other rules are that it must be within no man's land and not within 6 inches of a different objective marker. You can then go on to make more later in the game based off any of those objectives, but each player can basically only make one objective per turn. I'm not sure if that was the most super obvious way of explaining it, but basically over the course of the game there's going to be more and more objectives in the mid-board, and then you still score those objectives normally with 5 victory points per objective held at the end of the command phase, or the end of the game for the player going second in the 5th battle round. So pretty much a fight for the centre here, and it is helpful to have some more units to do actions. Purge the Foe is the kill units primary. You're still scoring 4 victory points per primary objective, and then an extra 4 victory points if you hold more. And then on top of that you get 4 victory points if you destroyed one enemy unit, and then another 4 victory points if you destroyed more than them. The small tweak to this one is that you can't score the extra 4 victory points for kill more on battle round 1. I guess that's helpful enough if both players have hidden all their armies and then one player has to venture out first when they get first turn. You'd get quite a big swing if they both killed one and killed more there. Next up we've got Linchpin, which is basically hold your own deployment zone and then hold things in the mid-board. If you just control the objective marker in your deployment zone you get 3 victory points, and then for any others on the board you get 5 victory points for them unless you don't hold the one in your own deployment zone, in which case you get 3. Basically hold on to your home base and venture out to take ones in the midfield. Then we've got Burden of Trust, 4 victory points for objectives that are held outside of the deployment zone, scored in the normal way, so nothing for your home objective here. You can then nominate a unit to guard any of those objectives that you held, which isn't an action, you just nominate them as a squad, and you score an extra 2 victory points at the end of your opponent's turn for each guarding unit still alive or an objective they control. It's basically like Sites of Power, the one with the characters, but without actually needing character datasheets. You can do it with other things now, which I think is probably an improvement. We've then got Scorched Earth, which is similar to the previous version on the right. This is the one where you raise objective markers. The core objective scoring is still 5 victory points per objective marker that you control, and then you can do an action to burn down objectives that aren't in your deployment zone. If you manage to burn them down, then you get 5 victory points per objective that you've done in the mid-board, and then 10 victory points if you manage to do it to your opponent's home base. The action is started in your shooting phase and then completes at the end of the enemy turn, so again it's one of the ones where the opponent can counter-attack and try and destroy your unit or retake the objective before you manage. Then it seems that we've got Unexploded Ordnance, which looks like it's the updated version of the much hated Servo Skulls mission. This one again is played with the objectives in no man's land and they're named as hazard markers. Rather than just pushed around passively like the Servo Skulls one was, you now need to do an action on those mid-board objectives. That action completes at the end of your turn, and if you complete it then you get to move the objective marker 6 inches in the direction of your choice. You want to push them towards the enemy's deployment zone as you get more victory points for objectives that are nearer or in it. Then you score points at the end of your turn rather than the end of the command phase as you do with most of the rest. 8 victory points per objective wholly within the enemy deployment zone, 5 victory points for markers wholly within 6 inches of the enemy deployment zone, or 2 victory points for markers wholly within 12 inches of the enemy deployment zone. You might actually be able to trigger that on both deployment zones, even with objectives right in the middle of the board, as per some of the new deployments, given that deployment zones are often a bit closer together than they were. At first glance, I must admit I don't think that this is massively improved on the Servo Skulls format. I guess it means you have to commit a bit more if you actually want to move the objectives around, but still seems to give a massive advantage to a player who could just move up and push all the objectives in the opponent's way turn 1. It means the opponent's then going to be fighting an uphill battle to try and just return them to the mid-board, never mind actually get them towards the opponent's half, so it seems to be one with a massive first turn advantage once more. I guess with new actions it might be a little bit easier to stop enemy units from pushing them back your way with things like locking them up. I would say it's probably better than Servo Skulls, but probably not by much in terms of giving advantages to the player going first. Finally, the 2 missions that are basically unchanged are Take and Hold and Supply Drop. Take and Hold is just the basic 40k mission format pretty much, 5 victory points per objective marker up to a maximum of 15. And then Supply Drop is the one with the disappearing objective markers, maybe just a little bit on the random side, given that it could heavily advantage one player depending on whether or not the last marker is near their greatest bastion of strength. If it goes one way or the other, it could severely help or hinder one player. Overall, mostly seems kind of fun on the primary missions though. Maybe one of the biggest changes is more actions needing to be done for these now, and between these and the secondary missions that you need to do actions for, it's going to heavily encourage slightly more nuisance cheap units to run around the board doing stuff. Primary missions are only half the story though, as they're backed up by the secondary missions, and they still keep the same fixed versus tactical missions that you can do. Your score capped at 40 victory points regardless of which one you choose. If you go tactical, then you draw 2 at the start of the turn, potentially can swap one out for 1 command point with new orders, and at the end of the turn you can drop one that you haven't managed to do and gain a command point, which can be quite a nice option early game. If you go fixed, then you get to pick 2 of the secondary missions. They have to be one of the ones that's nominated that you can take it as a fixed one, and then you have a more reliable mission. But in general, the fixed ones might be a little bit more low scoring, even if you do score them reliably. There's slightly more secondary objectives in this mission deck, 18 cards each, equal decks for attackers and defenders that have exactly the same rules on. Previously, there were 16 cards each, I believe. As mentioned earlier in the video, you can use that new order stratagem multiple times per game now, and most of the tactical objectives don't give you bonus victory points for taking tactical missions over the fixed ones. Most of the cards scored you slightly more for tactical missions versus fixed before, depending on the exact card. For the most part, the secondary mission deck has just largely been the same sort of general idea, but just slightly reinterpreted for this card. Either scores changed, a few new ones, or some with the same general idea but have just been altered a bit. There's 2 that have been flat out removed in Tempting Targets, the one where the opponent chooses an objective in the midboard, and then you need to try and take that objective. That did feel like it was just sort of doubling down on really good midboard control, which is what you wanted to do for primary anyway. And the capture enemy outpost one has gone, which was the big swing depending on whether or not you could take the opponent's home deployment zone. Sometimes it could be weirdly easy and sometimes it could be absolutely impossible, maybe not the worst to have such a massive amount of victory points swinging on. Otherwise, investigate signals is kind of gone, though I feel like it's just been reinterpreted, rather than being corners of the board, it's edges of the board, but remaining the same sort of feel. Going through the secondary objectives then, Marked for Death is one that they previewed, a tactical only one, and if you draw it, the opponent nominates 3 units. If you can kill any of them, then you score 5 victory points. Maybe not the worst draw in the world if you do it late game. If it's early game and loads of stuff is hidden, then it's probably going to be impossible. Cull the Horde can be taken fixed if you want to. This one's destroy an infantry unit of 20 or more models, or an infantry unit with 25 or more wounds in it, and if you do that, then you gain 5 victory points. If you happen to draw this and you don't have any Horde units in the opponent's army, then you can just redraw a new one. But this one does seem like quite a powerful counter-Horde secondary pick against something like Unending Swarm or Orc's Green Tide. If you're playing against an army that's got like 6 Horde units like that, and you don't manage to kill 3 of them over the course of the game, then it's probably gone very badly for you, and does feel like quite a powerful counter-Horde instant pick. Next up, we've got Recover Assets. Again, this one can be a fixed one, and you do this as an action that completes at the end of the opponent's next turn. You can do the action with 1 unit wholly in no man's land, 1 unit in your deployment zone, and 1 unit in the enemy deployment zone. And if you manage to do it with all 3, you get 6 victory points. If you manage to do it with 2, then you get 3 victory points. And this one is one that completes at the end of the enemy's turn, so they might have chance to move and destroy your units before it finishes. Kind of low scoring, but seems kind of reliable to be able to get that done on multiple turns with 1 unit in your deployment zone and 1 in the midboard. Maybe not the worst thing in the world to do with some objective camping units perhaps. Next there's Established Locus, which is the new version of Teleport Homers. 1 unit can do an action within the enemy deployment zone or within 6 inches of the centre of the board. You get 2 victory points if you do it in the centre, or 4 victory points in the enemy's DZ. So that basically amounts to Teleport Homers but lower scoring. It was one of the commonly more done fixed ones, and it does mean that unless you can get to the backfield now, that's going to be quite a low scoring one. Might not be so good against an enemy that can screen well or react and repel you from their drop zone. Next up, we've got another action one called Sabotage. This one you have to do with a unit in a terrain feature that's not in your deployment zone, and you do it as an action that ends at the end of the opponent's turn, so again one of the ones where they can move and try and repel you. 3 victory points if you manage to do it in no man's land, which should be easy enough most of the time. 6 victory points if you manage to do it in the enemy deployment zone. Potentially quite a big deal if you can drop something safe in there. Next we've got Containment, which feels like it's the new version of Investigate Signal. You do actions with units that are within 9 inches of a board edge and not within your deployment zone. It completes immediately, though you still have the action effects until the end of the turn, and per each board edge that you contain, you get 3 victory points to the maximum of 6. This one feels a bit less arduous than the Investigate Signal one to me. Pretty doable for units that are moving up the flanks and shouldn't be too hard to score 6 victory points on, I feel. Next, we've got the new version of Bring It Down, which isn't quite as strong as it was. This one's a fixed option, and you basically get 2 victory points for any monster or vehicle unit that's destroyed, and then plus 2 victory points if the total wounds of that unit was 15 or more, and a further plus 2 if the wounds characteristic was 20 or more, such as a big Titanic Knight or similar. Kind of interesting that sort of medium tier battle tank type vehicles will now only be worth 2 victory points, which isn't that much. It means that even if you're killing the vast majority of something like a Space Marine Ironstorm list, you might still not max this. So kind of a big deal for vehicle armies not having a reactive secondary objective that's going to yield big points easily. Compared with this and the anti-horde one, I feel like the anti-horde one is just so much better. Area denial is a bit more straightforward than it was before, as it was a bit weirdly worded. It's basically 2 victory points if you can get your unit within 3 inches of the centre of the board, and there's no enemies within 3 inches of the centre of the board at the end of your turn. And that's boosted to 5 victory points if there's no enemies within 6 inches. Aircraft and battle-shocked units aren't allowed to do this one, and still perhaps could be a pretty easy win if you're going first, and you've got something that can make it to that mid-board. Next up, the new version of Behind Enemy Lines can be fixed once more. This one's kind of similar, 3 victory points if you've got 1 unit wholly within the enemy deployment zone, not aircraft or battle-shocked things, or 4 victory points if you have 2. Fairly similar stuff there if you took it fixed. If you take it tactical, then it's not quite as rewarding as it was. Assassination again can be fixed, 4 victory points per character killed, and if you draw this as a tactical objective, it instead flips to being 5 victory points if you've killed at least 1 character model that battle round, but you don't get more if you kill, say, 3 of them. Cleanse is similar to how it was before, actions in the midboard. These ones complete at the end of the turn, 2 victory points for 1 objective marker cleanse, and 4 victory points if you manage to cleanse 2 or more midboard objective markers. Again, the reward on this one was a bit more if you were using tactical objectives at 3 and 5. Extend Battle Lines is back again. This one's 5 victory points for controlling your home objective and at least 1 objective in No Man's Land, or just 2 victory points if you've just got 1 squad left and hold a No Man's Land one. This one remains a pretty easy one really, and unless things are going horribly, should be kind of a given if you draw that in tactical. Then we've got Engaged on All Fronts, again can be fixed. You need to put units into 4 board quarters ideally. They can't be aircraft or battle-shocked units, and they can't be within 6 inches of the centre of the table. There's no more restriction as to being 3 inches away from other table quarters. You get 2 victory points for 3 quarters, which should often be doable, or 4 victory points for 4. Storm Hostile Objective is victory points for taking away an objective marker that the opponent held, 4 victory points for controlling one that they controlled at the start of the turn, or if they didn't control any and you hold at least 1. You have the option to shovel this back into the deck and redraw a new one turn 1 if you want to, given that there's a good chance they might not be on any objectives you can reach. Finally, there's 4 ones that are basically unchanged. Defend Stronghold for 3 victory points to defend your home objective. If the opponent doesn't have it by the end of their turn, then 3 victory points, and you've got to redraw this if you draw it round 1 as it's too easy. No Prisoners for 2 victory points per slain unit up to a maximum of 5. Overwhelming Force for 3 victory points per slain unit on objectives up to a maximum of 5. And Secure No Man's Land for 2 victory points for objective controlled in No Man's Land, or if you have 2 or more then it's 5 victory points. Overall, I feel like these aren't super generous on the victory points for the most part. Maybe some armies having to work a little bit harder than before to try and max out their secondary objectives. I feel like with so many actions on the board, there's going to be a lot of priority on fast-moving cheap units. Probably slightly good news for vehicles and slightly bad news for hordes given the changes to the actual kill secondary objectives for them. It maybe feels like a few of the easiest ones don't give you quite as many victory points as they used to. It certainly depends on the game and the turn. Overall though, doesn't seem like anything too crazy or wild, and feels like there'll be a good set of secondaries to use. Will be interesting to see if a few more people go for reliable fixed type ones this time round, given that there's less specific reward for doing them as tactical. Finally, for the mission deck, we get onto those secret missions, basically replacing the gambits that had a similar sort of catch-up style mechanic. Again, this is something that you can invoke at the end of Battle Round 3, though you can now only do it if your primary mission victory points are less than or equal to your opponent's, though it could be kind of weird that you could still be ahead at this point if you're doing far better on secondaries. The idea of this is that you have the choice of 4 cards, you no longer have any options locked out, you get to literally choose which of the 4 secret missions you'd like to do. Pick out that mission, and as the name would suggest, you keep it secret, and they all amount to either 0 VP or 20 victory points at the end of the game, depending on whether you can do it or not. It does come with a downside in that over the whole course of the game you can't score any more than 20 victory points on primary objectives, where you'd normally be able to get 50, but it also doesn't stop you scoring some more primary points from now on. Say if you only had 15 primary points so far, you could still try and get together the final 5 primary points while you work on the secret mission and any other secondary objectives. Then your opponent is going to be all very spooked and trying to be countering all 4 of the different options here as they don't know which one you've picked. Command insertion basically means that you need to try and get your warlords to the enemy home objective by the end of the game. Then that gets you the 20 victory points if you control it. The opponent will be under pressure to kill or screen your warlord from doing that. That definitely could be very possible though for certain aggressive warlords going forward, if they basically manage to smash through enemy lines to the home objective, even if the midfield has all gone your opponent's way. War attrition is a battle line one. You need to destroy all the enemy's battle line units or make sure that they're all within their own deployment zone, and then you need to get one of your own battle line units within the deployment zone as well. And if you manage to do that, then you get the 20 victory points, which against armies without any battle line or very little, it could be a big deal. Particularly if you've got battle line units that could potentially do some redeploy type shenanigans, maybe things like Grey Knight strike squads. That feels like it could be one of the easiest in the right matchup and a bit spooky for the opponent. Otherwise, there's Shatter Cohesion, which is basically table or near table the entire enemy army, either destroy all the enemy units or make sure every single one is battle shocked below half strength or over 3 inches from an objective marker. The below half strength one seems to be the one most in your control. Sometimes you might be in a place where you can try and make that happen. In reality though, I feel like most of the time, unless you've absolutely almost destroyed every unit of both players' armies off the map, if you have basically tabled the opponent, then probably just continuing with primary objectives might have been the best idea. And finally we've got Unbroken Wall. This one means that you control 3 or more objectives not in your deployment zone at the end of the battle. I guess the theory could be that you could have a whole bunch of units that are playing safe and ready to pounce on all the objectives if you went second perhaps. But again, if you were doing that, then you were probably going to score a whole bunch of victory points at the end of the game anyway. So maybe it feels like a bit of a less good trade-off than it might otherwise be. Overall though, these certainly look a lot more usable and a lot more threatening than Gambits ever did. For some armies some of the time they could genuinely be worth pursuing as the best path to victory. You'd have to take a look at the game state and the score on the enemy army at the end of turn 3. If you're behind on primary victory points, then it could be a real option. You need to weigh up whether or not the secret mission is going to be achieved and how many victory points you'd be likely to get if you didn't go for it. I feel like there's going to be so many variations depending on what army you're playing and what army the opponent's playing and how the game is going, that it's probably just going to have to be a judgment call each time, though some armies do look like they'll be able to do these better, particularly with aggressive warlords to fight to the home objective, or speedy mobile battle line to seriously threaten the battle line in the home field one. I could imagine that this could be pretty irritating for an opponent to play against, particularly if they feel like they're winning the game on the standard missions as it was, and then they basically have to counteract the opponent doing one of 4 different annoying secondary missions. It could really divide your priorities quite a bit, maybe countering things that weren't even there to start with, and potentially could allow the secret mission player to achieve a good victory even if they were significantly behind on primary points. Certainly seems interesting though. Will be fun to see whether or not they actually make regular appearances in games. I suspect they will at least sometimes. Overall, for first impressions though, I feel like the mission deck looks kind of fun. The previous mission pack I think worked really quite well already. I like the format of play and probably more so than the big tables of secondaries that you were choosing from in 9th edition. The cards just feel a bit more punchy, particularly with the tactical missions. For the rules changes, I'm broadly in favour of everything that they changed out of the core rules, actions being a central defined thing once more, a bit of clarification as to the deployment process, and OC0 units not doing actions I think is probably a sensible enough thing, though it's obviously going to be bad news for them. For the deployments, I'm not really sure that there's that big of a change there. They maybe feel a little bit more arbitrary than they do completely game changing. I guess if anything it might be a little boost to melee type armies that might want to rush in, given that a couple of the deployment zones start a few inches closer now. For the mission rules, nothing really too crazy, a bunch of alright benefits to battle line things that occasionally in some games could be annoying if one army's got loads of battle line and the other army has little, I guess. Slightly mixed feelings about Chilling Rain going away, but you could house rule not to use it in casual play if you wanted. For the primary missions, they broadly look fun. I feel like they probably could have just gotten rid of the servo scores equivalent altogether and done something else though, rather than changing it to actions. My first impression would be that that wouldn't change things too much, but maybe it'll be better in practice than it looks. The new secondary missions all seem fairly sensible. Definitely between the primaries and secondaries there's going to be a big focus on those action units, and the secret missions at least seem impactful and far more worth including this time round. I'm sure people will be having some fun with them. I just hope that they still remain in the sort of place where you might occasionally win a game with a secret mission, as opposed to it overall being seen as an advantage. Putting all of that together, it's probably a little bit early to say how armies are going to change, given that we've still got the points changes and balanced data slate things that are going to go hand in hand with this. It might be that some of the units that got better or worse will get points adjustments, or there might be some further balanced data slate rules that we don't know about yet. Just at first takes though, melee rush armies won't mind being able to deploy a bit further forward, and gumming up units in close combat and engagement range will basically always prevent actions now, which is quite big. There'll certainly be a big shift between minimum investment objective control 0 units to minimum investment objective control 1 units, things like 50-point squads of 5 guys to run around doing things. They'll certainly need more of them than before. Titanic units and Titanic characters seem to have come out of this relatively well between better action use and counting as more drops in the deployment. They have thought about big knights here, which is nice. On top of that, vehicles in general haven't done too badly with Bring It Down being nerfed. Otherwise, battle line units in general do have a bunch of advantages here between the various primary missions, some of which are actually quite good for them, and that one secret mission where it genuinely has advantage to putting a bunch of battle line things on the board. If you've got good battle line choices, then it's probably good for your army. Otherwise, besides OC0 units, maybe other losers might be 20 model units, particularly the armies that maybe wanted to really spam them like Green Tide or Unending Swarm. Still won't be necessarily all that easy to put down their units, but I feel like plenty of armies do have the tools they need to take out enough units to max out the secondary by the end of the game, particularly if the Horde player is expending their units to hold the primaries against all comers without dealing as much damage as other lists. There's also maybe a little bit less need to definitely have characters in your army in a big way if you've got Sites of Power as a possible mission. Maybe not the worst ever to pivot away from one given datasheet there though. In any case though, let me know what your thoughts are on 40k's big new update and mission deck. Look forward to hearing all your ideas down in the comments below, and how do you think that this might impact your army. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. I'll certainly look forward to covering any of the other 40k updates out there as well. I'll certainly talk through the points and balanced data slate changes when we get them. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel and you'd like to help keep them coming, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.